Welcome to the 4C webinar series. Very much appreciate all in attendance today, and very much appreciate Kati Petersburg of Trinity for conducting the webinar today. We'll be talking about the overlap of ethylene, EMACT, and the BWON rule. And as you all know, the BWON rule has great clarity. There's absolutely no confusing elements to the BWON rule, and of course that's not true. BWON rule is one of the most confusing rules probably in the regulatory landscape for refineries and chemical plants. So Kati, take it away. If you share your screen and take it away.
Okay, great. Let me. All right, can you see now?
Correct.
Okay. So I am. Okay. So good morning. Thanks everybody for joining us today for the BWON and EMACT overlap provisions webinar. Thanks Steve for inviting me to present. My name's Kati Petersburg. I am a managing consultant with Trinity Consultants. I started with Trinity about 6 years ago in the Denver office. And while I still live in Denver, I'm now part of the Trinity Houston organization. I serve as the national BWON lead for Trinity's chemical services sector, for which Inas Darat is the director. I've been working as a consultant for a little over 20 years, primarily for the petroleum refinery industry and chemical plants, with a big emphasis on BWON, and more recently a focus on the EMACT and the overlap provisions. So if you're on the webinar today, my expectation is that you have some familiarity with both the BWON and the EMACT. So today's discussion is going to include a brief overview of the regulations with a focus on the sections of the BWON that are specifically referred to in the overlap provisions. And then we will talk about what this means for you practically. So, as you know, during ethylene production, benzene will be generated in waste, making that site subject to the BWON regulation. Ethylene plants are also subject to the ethylene MACT or the EMACT, which contains overlap provisions with the BWON. The EMACT requires compliance with the BWON, and then it includes additional requirements for ethylene plants, which include an expansion of the control provisions, new requirements for waste sent off site as well as flares, and some modifications to the notifications and reporting requirements.
Yeah, we can do that. You want me to put in the work request and then send you the number?
Sorry, we'll mute that, Kati.
That's okay.
That's what I'm saying. You want me to put in the work order?
Are we good?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's get started with the BWON, or the Benzene Waste Operations NESHAP, which, as we now know, ethylene plants are required to comply with. So the BWON requirements are codified in 40 CFR Part 61 Subpart FF. The main topics that we are going to be addressing today are who is subject to the BWON, what materials are regulated by the BWON, what is entailed in the tab and compliance quantifications, and what are the components of a BWON compliance program. So the applicability conditions of the BWON, which are found at 61.340, they state that the BWON applies to owners and operators of chemical manufacturing plants, coke byproduct recovery plants, petroleum refineries, and TSDFs that manage waste from those facilities. Now, the majority of you are likely attending this webinar because you're associated with a chemical plant. So what is considered a chemical plant in the BWON? Now, bear in mind that there are various definitions among the environmental regulations. So I've included the definition of a chemical manufacturing plant from the BWON on this slide. I'm not going to read this, but I do want to point out that the BWON specifically identifies ethylene manufacturing facilities in the rule. However, there are other considerations to make if you are a chemical manufacturing plant. So if you are a facility who is identified as a chemical process plant, which is one of the 28 source categories named in the NSR definition of a major stationary source, then you are likely subject to the BWON. If you are a facility that is subject to one of the many EMACT standards that contain overlap provisions with the BWON, including the EMACT, then you are subject to the BWON. If any one process at your facility triggers the provisions of the BWON, then your entire facility is subject to the BWON. So if you have multiple activities at your facility and the BWON applies, if you have multiple activities at your facility, the BWON applies to all of those activities, not only those that triggered the BWON. And if benzene occurs at any stage of production at your facility, whether this is raw materials, processing, mixing, final product, and there is the potential for benzene to end up in your waste streams, you are subject to the to the BWON. Another thing I'd like to point out is that while the BWON is found in the air regulations, it is more easily understood as a wastewater regulation. At no point in the BWON compliance, would you determine what your actual emissions are. Rather, you focus on the potential of the amount of benzene that could theoretically volatilize. Now, the BWON's fundamental stipulation is for benzene-containing waste to be managed in controlled systems until that waste is either treated to remove the benzene or returned to the process. And if vapors are generated from control equipment, those vapors must also be managed in controlled systems until treated or directed to a fuel gas system. So air quality regulations, they typically require affected sites to quantify their potential pollutant emissions in order to establish which sites are major and which are not. And then only the major emission sources are required to implement control provisions. In the case of the BWON, only those sites with large amounts of benzene-containing wastes must control and treat their wastes and associated vapors. Now, the trigger for the control provisions is found in the waste characterization called the TAB, or total annual benzene. And that's the sum of the benzene loading in aqueous BWON-regulated waste materials at their point of generation, or point of waste generation, or POG. Now, aqueous in the BWON means that a material is greater than 10% water at either its point of generation or at any time during its management as a BWON waste. So what are BWON regulated materials? Well, the definition of waste in the BWON is a bit more far-reaching than what you find in other regulations like RCRA or the HON. I've highlighted the significant parts of the definition here, and I'll go ahead and read that. So waste is any material that is discarded or is being accumulated, stored, or treated prior to being discarded, recycled, or discharged. So what that means is that waste materials under the BWON, even if they're recycled or sent back to the process, those are still subject to this rule. On this slide, there are a number of examples of waste materials. In bold are the two that are specifically identified in the EMACT, that's spent caustic, and that would include the associated hydrocarbon. We're going to talk about that a little bit on the next slide, and dilution steam blowdown. Okay, so a point of waste generation or point of generation in the BWON. The definition of this varies from a point of determination, or a POD, as defined in other EMACT wastewater regulations. In the BWON, the point of generation is often upstream of where you would identify the POD, let's say under the HON. In this diagram, you can see that I've depicted the POG as the spent caustic discharging from the caustic tower before it's directed to a separator or a coalescer, where the organic phase is typically separated out and recovered, while the de-oiled spent caustic is likely sent to a treatment process like a wet air oxidation unit. You can see that the point of generation is at the discharge of the caustic tower, not the separator, which means that the point of generation includes the benzene loading in both the organic phase, even though it's recovered, and the aqueous phase. Now, this is kind of a significant theme with the BWON. Both phases of every point of generation must be accounted for in the tab quantification. This is important when you consider that if the organic phase of a stream is just 1% of the total throughput or flow, but the concentration is 100 times what you find in the water phase, that's going to double the benzene loading in that particular waste stream. So we've talked about the tab quantification, which is the trigger for the control provisions in the BWON. And the tab is the sum, like I said before, of the benzene loading in aqueous BWON wastes, both the uncontrolled and the controlled. We will talk briefly a little bit later about how to determine your tab quantification. But the thing right now to know is that if your tab is greater than 10 megagrams per year benzene, then your site is subject to the control provisions. If the tab quantification is less than 10 megagrams per year, then your site does not need to implement the control provisions under just the BWON, though the tab quantification must be redetermined each year. And then with a tab less than 1, you submit only the initial tab. So for facilities that trigger the control provisions, because their tab's greater than 10 megs, the BWON recognizes, because of reality, practical situations, that not all benzene containing waste can be controlled. So the regulation allows for certain benzene containing waste to be managed in uncontrolled systems. And there are 3 compliance alternatives that are spelled out in the BWON, and they allow for different amounts and types of waste to be controlled. So the 6BQ, I'll talk about what each of those are. The 6BQ compliance option, where BQ stands for benzene quantity. This is EPA's preferred method or alternative. The 6BQ places a total allowable benzene threshold ceiling of 6 megagrams per year on all your uncontrolled aqueous wastes, regardless of their benzene concentration. So this alternative allows the site to choose which streams to control, which to leave uncontrolled, and how much they're going to treat the ones they've controlled. Under the 2 meg, this is sometimes referred to as the segregate and treat option. Facilities need to control and treat the waste streams whose concentration at the point of generation is greater than 10 ppm, except for any number of streams that the facility selects whose benzene concentration is greater than 10, but their benzene loading contributes to a 2 meg per year ceiling or threshold. So the streams that are controlled must be treated to so that their effluent concentration is less than 10. And then the treat to 1 option, which you don't see very often, requires a facility to control and treat the majority of their processed wastewaters with the total effluent from the treatment plus any processed wastewaters that remain uncontrolled to sum to less than 1 megagram per year. Essentially, all 3 of these compliance alternatives involve demonstrating that the uncontrolled benzene does not exceed whatever the allowable ceiling is, that the systems that are managing the controlled waste are truly controlled, and that the devices treating the waste are operating properly. All right, so a BWON controlled waste management system. That's going to include various categories of affected units. Those are listed here. The basic control requirement is for affected units to be closed, sealed, and operated to prevent benzene emissions. Now, no detectable emissions in the BWON means an instrument reading of less than 500 ppm VOC using method 21, which is basically the same as LDAR monitoring. Equipment can sometimes be open or unsealed for things like waste movement, equipment maintenance, or relief to prevent damage. However, routine vent gases from an affected unit, those have to be directed to a control device or a fuel gas system. Let's see, confirming sealed status typically involves monitoring for leaks initially and annually. That's method 21. And then visually inspecting for leaks initially and quarterly. There are some caveats here with alternate standards for tanks, but we're not going to get into those. For control devices, combustion-related control devices, you need to continuously monitor an operating parameter, while carbon-related control devices, you periodically monitor the effluent vapor. Apologies about the highlighting here. I don't know why that's there, so please just ignore it. There's nothing special about that annual report. Okay, so BWON reporting requirements. For facilities with a tab greater than 10, under the BWON, by the date of initial startup, every facility has to submit an initial certification. This initial certification says that the equipment necessary to comply with the BWON has been installed and that the required initial inspections and tests have been carried out. An annual report, which is typically submitted on April 7th for the previous calendar year, that's also required by the BWON. In addition to the tab quantification that we talked about, for facilities whose tab is greater than 10, there's also a compliance demonstration in which you quantify the benzene loading in only your uncontrolled waste, and you put that towards an allowable ceiling. So that's either going to be the 6 or the 2 or the 1. For both the tab and the compliance quantification, there is a general requirement for a table where you list all the waste streams or the points of generation, say whether it's aqueous or non-aqueous, and whether or not it's controlled. In this table, you also include point of generation characterization data, like your annual waste quantity and range and annual flow weighted concentration data, so that you can get an annual benzene quantity for each waste stream. And then you sum each waste's benzene quantity. So to obtain a facility-wide tab quantification, you would sum all of the uncontrolled and controlled waste to get the tab. And then for the compliance quantification, you would sum just your uncontrolled wastes. Now you'll want to keep records of these, including of the characterization data, like sampling locations, your calculations, what process information you use, things like that that you apply when you're determining the benzene quantities. But also in the annual report, or going back to the annual report, you want to include a summary of leaks that were found during your visual inspections and instrument monitoring. And in that summary, you're going to include the date that it occurred and any corrective actions that were taken. This is also a pretty good place to discuss changes in your program or your facility, such as a new process unit or waste management system. Let's see. In addition to the annual reports, there is a quarterly report that needs to be submitted under the BWON, and this quarterly report certifies that the required inspections of the controlled waste management system were conducted during the previous quarter. So you don't need to include the results of these inspections because those are included in the annual report. Although some sites do choose to include them in the quarterly reports as well. However, issues that are related to treatment devices and control devices, those are included in the quarterly report. And again, you would include a description of the problem and what the corrective actions were. Okay, that kind of sums up the BWON requirements. So let's move on to the EMACT. The EMACT, or ethylene MACT, which is intended to control organic HAPs from ethylene plants or propylene plants or propylene plants. This was promulgated in 2000 along with several other MACT rules as part of the generic MACT or subpart YY. Along with YY, subpart XX was simultaneously promulgated, and this is where you will find the requirements for ethylene process wastes and heat exchange systems. We're going to be focusing on process wastes. Okay, so the ethylene MACT RTR, or the Risk and Technology Review, the final rule for that was proposed in October of 2019, proposed in October of 2019, and then published on July 6th of last year. So you'll see the compliance date for that is either initial startup of a facility or 3 years after publication of the RTR, which would mean that those changes go into effect in July of 2023. The RTR includes updates to the EMACT standard, although today I'm only going to be discussing the changes to the EMACT that apply to the BWON overlap. So as I mentioned before, the EMACT is intended to control the emissions of organic HAPs from ethylene and propylene plants. Now, one thing to note is that these facilities, any process and equipment that are subject to either MACT CC or the HON, they're exempt from the EMACT, except as provided for in the wastewater overlap provisions. The EMACT regulates emissions from a number of organic HAPs. Those include benzene and 1,3-butadiene, which are the two constituents that I'm going to focus on today, as they are the constituents that the overlap provisions are concerned with. The EMACT contains several overlap provisions, and I've listed them here. And they, of course, include the benzene waste operations NESHAP. I'm not going to go through what those are. However, collectively, subparts YY and XX, along with those overlap provisions listed on the previous slide, they aim to control emissions from these 6 source categories. So heat exchange systems, waste operations, storage vessels, process vents, transfer racks, and equipment leaks. Now, only the waste operations provisions address the BWON. Okay, so now we get to the overlap provisions. Subpart XX requires compliance with the BWON. So if you're subject to the EMACT, you're subject to the BWON. No questions there. Ethylene facilities that have a tab that's less than 10 and would therefore be exempt from the control provisions of the BWON normally under subpart FF, those are not exempt from the requirements of the EMACT. I'm just going to point out it's very rare for an ethylene plant to have a tab less than 10, but we're going to talk about all of the parts of the rule in here, but just keep that in mind. Subpart XX also includes additional requirements to control certain butadiene containing waste streams, and we're going to get into what those are in a little bit, as well as modified requirements for both wastes shipped off-site and for flares. And there are some reporting and notification requirements in the EMACT that supersede those that are in the BWON. So the EMACT specifically discusses benzene containing and butadiene containing wastewater streams. Let's talk about the benzene containing wastewater streams first. So under the EMACT, spent caustic and dilution steam blowdown must be controlled and treated per the BWON, regardless of a facility's tab. There is a process wastewater exemption. So if you have streams that are less than 0.005 GPM or less than 10 megagrams per year total waste quantity, those are exempt from the control provisions. Now, facilities that have a tab of less than 10, you must control and treat your spent caustic and dilution steam blowdown according to the treatment requirements of the BWON, which are found in 61.348. Except during periods of startup, shutdown, or malfunction. Now the RTR, remember we just talked about that, they removed the SSM exemption. So that brings the EMACT a bit more in line with the BWON. The BWON does not have any exemptions for SSM. So in 2023, the SSM exemption in EMACT, that no longer exists. There are new initial certification and annual report requirements for the spent caustic and dilution steam blowdown streams. And you would include information that's required in the BWON in 61.357A2 and 3. Now you're going to see those citations a couple of times in the coming slides. Just know that A2, that one talks about whether a stream is managed in a controlled system, and A3 talks about the waste characterization data, like concentration, flow rate, that type of information. Facilities with a tab greater than 10 must control and treat all waste streams with greater than 10 ppm benzene. And you can still opt to comply with any 3 compliance options included with the benzene, included in the BWON. Okay, continuous butadiene waste streams, or let's talk about butadiene containing waste streams, which in the EMACT focus on continuous butadiene wastewater streams. So what are those? Those are wastewater streams that contain greater than 10 ppm butadiene, and they meet the definition of a continuous butadiene waste stream. I'm going to go ahead and read what that is, but basically there's 4 streams that are listed in the definition in the EMACT. So a continuous butadiene waste stream is continuously flowing processed wastewater from the aqueous drain from the debutanizer reflux drum, water separators on the C4 crude butadiene transfer piping, and the C4 butadiene storage equipment, and then spent wash water from the C4 crude butadiene carbonyl wash system. Continuous butadiene waste streams are waste streams that are not covered by another NESHAP, which would include streams that have greater than 10 ppm benzene, because those are covered by the BWON. Let's see. Okay, so continuous butadiene wastewater streams that contain greater than 10 ppm butadiene, those have to be controlled and treated per the BWON or the HON. Now, I'm not going to talk about the HON in this webinar, but if you have questions about the overlap provisions with the HON, you can email me and we can talk about it after this webinar. Okay, so they have to be controlled per the BWON or the HON regardless of a facilities tab, except during periods of SSM. So again, the RTR has removed that exemption. So in 2023, SSM exemption goes away. I'll also point out that water content is not needed for butadiene waste streams like it is for benzene streams, because butadiene streams don't need to contain any certain amount of water to be considered a wastewater. Also, you don't need to determine the butadiene concentration if you are just going to designate a stream as controlled. So if your facility has continuous butadiene waste streams, they need to be managed in controlled systems, and they must be included in your inspections and monitoring program. So those categories of affected units under the BWON that we talked about before, you need to meet all of the control requirements for each of those. Actually, 61, 343 through 348, which doesn't include control and treatment devices. And for the record keeping and reporting requirements, those for the continuous butadiene waste streams, those are the same as they are in the BWON, except when you're reading through the BWON, anytime you see the word benzene, you would substitute it with 1,3-butadiene, and anytime you see the word waste stream, you would substitute continuous butadiene waste stream. And nothing else changes for those. If there are no continuous butadiene waste streams at your facility, then you need to include a statement to that effect with your initial tab report. Okay, waste shipped off-site and flares. So for waste that are shipped off-site with greater than 10 ppm benzene or butadiene, ethylene plants, or if you're subject to the EMACT, you need to follow the requirements of the EMACT rather than the BWON. You can find those requirements at subpart XX 63-1096. But basically it says that a notice must be sent with the waste shipment stating that the waste contains organic HAP and it needs to be treated in accordance with subpart XX. And then the receiver of that waste, they need to submit a written certification to the administrator that it will treat the waste according to subpart XX. Regarding flares, facilities that are subject to the EMACT, if you use a steam-assisted, air-assisted, non-assisted, or pressure-assisted multi-point flare to comply with the BWON, then you need to comply with the requirements of 63-1003 rather than the BWON flare requirements. All right. So there are changes to the reporting and notification requirements, and this is where things can get a little hairy. Okay, those can be found in Table 2 of Subpart XX. Now, we're going to be talking about the requirements for a lot of different reports. There's the initial certification, initial notification, initial and annual tab, compliance quantification, notice of compliance status. You may already know that the BWON requires most things to be done, certified, and submitted relatively early in the operation of a new plant at startup, right? So whereas the EMACT requires these submittals months after startup. So let's go through what those are, what the changes are. If you're a facility that has a tab that's less than 10, you need to submit the initial tab report that's required by the BWON as part of the initial notification required by the EMACT. And with that initial tab, you need to include continuous butadiene waste streams. Additionally, you will need to, and this is new for facilities with a tab less than 10, new with the EMACT overlap provisions, you need to submit an initial certification that the initial inspections and monitoring have been done for controlled waste management systems that handle spent caustic, dilution steam blowdown, and continuous butadiene waste streams. You're going to submit that initial certification as part of the NOCS, or Notice of Compliance Status, that's required by the EMACT. And then last, you're going to submit the information required in the annual tab report for those streams, spent caustic, dilution steam blowdown, and continuous butadiene wastewater streams on the anniversary of the NOCS. So changes to the reporting for facilities with a tab greater than 10. So this first one's the same. You're going to submit the initial tab report as part of the initial notification required by the EMACT and include continuous butadiene waste streams. The initial certification that you would normally have to do under the BWON for your controlled waste management system, you're going to include continuous butadiene waste streams in that, and you're going to submit that information as well as your annual tab report as part of the NOCS. So I want to note that you're still going to submit the tab and compliance quantifications annually, and that's going to happen on the anniversary of the NOCS, along with the other information that's required in the annual report. So the summary of problems that were identified during your leaks, or leak problems that were identified during your inspections and monitoring. Also, any record keeping and reporting requirements that are not specifically mentioned in the overlap provisions, those are still mandatory under the BWON. So just because you're complying with the EMACT reporting and notification requirements does not mean that you are complying with the BWON. So this means, for example, there are periodic reports that are required by the EMACT. Those do not replace the quarterly reports that are required by the BWON. So the quarterly reports that certify you've done your inspections and monitoring, and they summarize any issues that you had with your treatment and control devices, those still need to be submitted each quarter, even though you're submitting periodic reports for the EMACT. Okay, so how exactly is the site going to coordinate all this? What do? Do you ignore the BWON submittal dates since the EMACT requirements supersede the BWON dates? Or, as a demonstration of good faith, do you wish to submit certain information earlier than you would as required by the EMACT? But that's going to be more in line with what a regulator would expect. So as we go through the requirements from each of those regulations, these final couple of slides, I'm going to occasionally offer approaches for doing more, or I'll give you examples of when a facility will do more than what's strictly required. And this can prevent an agency from perceiving deficiencies in your reporting. So, like I said before, if you're an ethylene plant, likely you do not have a tab of less than 10, but if you do, there are the modified initial tab reporting requirements. So we just talked about those. The BWON requires the initial tab to be submitted by the date of initial startup. However, the EMACT provisions that supersede the BWON, they require the initial tab to be submitted with the initial notification. The initial notification is due 1 year after a facility is subject to the EMACT. So what some facilities do, and this is what we like this method, they'll submit their initial tab according to the schedule required by the BWON, and then they submit a copy as an attachment to the initial notification, and possibly with updates based on whatever portion of the operating year has passed. Okay, so for the additional initial certification and annual tab report requirements. Okay, for facilities that are not subject to the EMACT, if you have a tab less than 10, then there is no requirement to control any waste streams. So those facilities normally would never submit an initial certification. So this is a new requirement. Those facilities need to submit the initial certification that the inspections of monitoring for the controlled waste management system, specifically handling spent caustic, dilution steam blowdown, and continuous butadiene waste streams, you need to submit that those have been conducted. So the BWON requires that initial certification is submitted by the date of initial startup. The EMACT provisions, which again supersede the BWON, they require the initial certification to be submitted with the NOCS, and that's not due until 240 days after the compliance date or 60 days after the completion of the initial performance test or compliance assessment, whichever one is sooner. Now, what we've seen is that facilities will choose to submit this initial certification according to the schedule required by the BWON. So often you'll submit that with your initial tab, and then you submit a copy of that initial certification as an attachment to your NOCS. So a lot of facilities that are less than 10, if you are over 1, you would normally have to submit an annual tab. According to the EMACT, the annual tab is due on the anniversary of the NOCS, while the annual BWON reports are typically submitted on April 7th each year for the previous calendar year. So a lot of facilities prefer calendar year reporting periods and often switch to that April 7th deadline, and that's really an agreement that you need to come to with your regulator. So if they're expecting that report to come on the anniversary of the NOCS, then I would include a copy of it. But again, this is something that should be talked about with your regulator when they would be expecting that report. And then you need to follow the EMACT requirements for waste shipped off-site that we discussed, and also the change for the flare requirement. Okay, so this is probably going to be most of you, and that's facilities with a tab greater than 10. Now, there's not a whole lot that changes for a facility with a tab greater than 10, other than you would also capture the continuous butadiene waste streams in both your controlled waste management system, and you include information about those in your report, in your tab report. However, the notification and reporting requirements are also different, just like they are with facilities less than 10. So again, you would submit the initial tab report that's required by the BWON as part of the initial notification. The initial notification comes after the initial tab is due by the BWON. So just like facilities with a tab less than 10, we recommend submitting it when it's due for the BWON and including a copy of it as an attachment to your initial notification. You would submit your initial certification that you would normally do with the BWON, but remember to include continuous butadiene waste streams as part of your controlled waste management system. You'd submit that initial certification and the information required in your annual tab report as part of the NOCS under EMACT. So, and then of course with the tab report also include continuous butadiene waste streams. So again, BWON wants that initial certification by the startup date. EMACT asks for it months later. As I mentioned before, most facilities submit it at startup and include a copy with the NOCS. And like I said, we do like that approach. The tab and compliance quantifications, those still need to be submitted annually along with all of the other information required in the annual BWON report. That's now due on the anniversary of the NOCS or the date that was agreed upon between you and the regulators. Also remember the quarterly reports are still due per the BWON regulation. So those semi-annual or those periodic reports required under the EMACT do not do away with the quarterly reports. And again, we have the new waste shipped off site and flare requirements. All right, that's it. That covers the overlap provisions of the BWON and the EMACT. So I don't know, Steve, if you had any questions that came up.
There was a question. Would you explain why EPA prefers 6BQ?
So I think EPA prefers, well, the reason I say EPA prefers 6BQ is because that's usually the compliance alternative that's going to show up in a consent decree. Now, the consent decrees haven't necessarily hit all the chemical plants like they have the petroleum refining industry. But if you see a consent decree from the petroleum refining industry, and those consent decrees are going to say, if you're not already in a compliance alternative, you're going to choose the 6BQ. Why they like that approach, I think it's probably because it's the easiest one to validate. So with the 2BQ, which is the other one that's, you know, a lot of facilities employ, there is a requirement to demonstrate that the streams that are not being controlled are less than 10, less than 10 ppm. A lot of facilities don't do that. So there's, I think, a lacking of documentation there. And I think with the 6BQ, the concentration for the concentration data for your controlled streams is less important because they don't get counted towards the 6BQ. Whereas with the 2BQ, you have to know the concentration before you say it's controlled or uncontrolled, right? Because if it's over 10, you have to control it or count it towards your 2. If it's under 10, you're not controlling it. So I think it's just easier for EPA to confirm the validity of programs with the 6BQ.
Okay, what is your opinion on whether a leak is a violation or is it only a violation and is not repaired?
There you go, that second one. So a leak in itself is not a violation. There are actually repair deadlines or first attempt at repair deadlines that are included in the BWON. Those are going to vary between 15 and 45 days, depending on the type of affected unit. So what the inspections and monitoring are supposed to do is identify problems when you have them, right? So the rule allows you to have those problems. You go out, you identify it, you have between 15 and 45 days to fix it. Now, there are some caveats to that with delay of repair. We're not going to get into that. So if you have not attempted to repair it within that period of time, then that would be a violation. I would also venture to say, and this is going to land on the conservative side of things, that if every time you go out and you inspect a certain affected unit or part of your controlled waste management system and you see that there's the same leak every time you go out and that's happening quarter after quarter, I don't know if that's going to pass the red face test that that's actually controlled. So those I would be on the lookout for. Just because you are meeting the deadline does not necessarily mean that you have validated that that system is controlled.
Correct.
Did that answer that question?
I think, yes. There's an
Okay.
interpretation out there that says it has to be designed to not leak, and therefore when it leaks, it's a violation.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is going to go back to the general provisions, right? I mean, you have a general duty to control your emissions. So that's, so even if you're not meeting specifically how the rule is written, how to control them, does not necessarily let you out of having to control your emissions.
Yeah, so it's an issue around if a facility looks at their inspection records and see that a particular piece of equipment has had a leak, which was then fixed, and that has occurred for many, many quarters in a row, they need to be aware that there's potential EPA enforcement around that particular topic, and the question gets to, it was designed to not leak. However, if it leaks for 20 quarters in a row, one may ask the question whether it's beyond the end of its useful life, because it was designed to not leak. Now, of course, that will fall down if you install a new piece of equipment and that piece of equipment leaks for the first 5 quarters. There would be an argument that the piece of equipment was not designed to not leak. So that's an issue that's out there, and what someone on the webinar to follow up to that would be to check to see if you have any equipment in your BWON program, and every quarter for the last some number of quarters, you pick a number, whether it's 3 or 5 or 10 or 20. And that goes back to what you said, Katie, was a red face test. If it's, there's a certain number beyond which you would start to have that red face test question. How many quarters in a row can a piece of equipment leak, and you fix it before this question of is it controlled comes into play.
Right. And, there's also the question of there's another 85, 90 days and a quarter, 89 days and a quarter typically, that are outside of the time that you're inspecting it. So if each time that you're going out there and inspecting it, if that's only once per quarter, and it's leaking every time. Now, I would say, I wouldn't say